Welcome to the Secure World Sessions. We're a brand new cybersecurity podcast that is all about access. Access to people and ideas that can impact your personal cybersecurity career and help you secure your organization. Hi, my name is Bruce Sussman. I'm Director of Content at Secure World and also your podcast host. And in today's session, we are opening the file on controversy, trust, and Huawei. We have an extensive, in-depth interview with Huawei Chief Security Officer Andy Purdy. He's been criticized by U.S. senators. He's been called a traitor on social media for telling us that we should trust Huawei. Purdy says his critics are missing the point.
One frustrating thing is sometimes people hear that I'm a defender of Huawei. They have a tendency not to listen to what I'm actually saying. I would suggest I'm not a defender of Huawei. People say, well, do you trust China or do you trust Huawei? I don't trust anybody.
However, he does trust the concept that the world needs Huawei for our future, for 5G. And he's pushing the idea that the company actually makes society safer.
Competition helps drive down cost, helps drive down price, helps increase innovation, helps promote additional security features, and it promotes resilience. You need multiple suppliers of your communication network. So if one goes down, you're still going to have access to the information.
I can't wait to share this in-depth interview with you. Will it sway your skepticism of Huawei, which is on the U.S. entity list and effectively banned from being used in U.S. networks? We are going to find out what you think. Also, in today's research note, I have new research from Trend Micro on 5G security risks. Trend Micro, by the way, is our exclusive podcast partner. Now, on to our featured interview with the CSO of Huawei. Now, we spoke at Secure World Seattle, and I quickly learned 3 things about Andy Purdy. Number 1, he travels the world in his role. Number 2, he now spends a lot of his time answering questions about Huawei and its trustworthiness. And number 3, he has quite the cybersecurity pedigree and used to work at extremely high levels within the United States government. I'll let him tell that part as we start our interview.
I had worked in the government a long time. I was a lawyer for a long time, and then I moved into cybersecurity, joining the White House staff, helping as part of the team that wrote the U.S. National Strategy to Secure Cyberspace. Then went over to the Department of Homeland Security and helped set that up, and for 2 years I was in charge of cybersecurity. And then I worked for a number of other companies, and I got recruited to join Huawei back in 2012. It's been quite an experience.
Well, I would say, and now thinking of all your experience with Homeland Security, with everything else, and thinking about even some of the press briefings I've been to where it's expressed that Huawei or Chinese bearing, companies are potentially a security risk. I mean, how has that been for you to be on the other side of that coin, if you will?
Well, I think I have an appreciation for what the government is trying to do in the larger perspective as we move into a world where it's not just the old military domains of land, sea, and air. Space is going to be a factor at some point, but cyberspace is kind of the 5th domain. And the United States has to make sure that we and our allies are safe. We have to make sure we address the risk. I think in the long term, the government's moving in the right direction in terms of trying to come up with a comprehensive approach. It looks like the European Union, Germany may be a little bit ahead of that. But eventually, they will do that, and that kind of thing is what's necessary to make America safer. I think they're kind of bending over backwards kind of because of the geopolitical situation between China and the U.S. And the bottom line is that banning Huawei is not going to make America safer.
Okay, interesting. Well, I know it's been a rough year for Huawei. I was just thinking about some of the things that have happened, indictments related to intellectual property theft, some of the headline-grabbing arrests in Canada and other places, the U.S. adding Huawei to the entity security list, which essentially bans Huawei from U.S. networks. With all of this smoke, can you understand how some in the security community might say there's got to be fire there as well?
Well, I think it's important for people to realize that the U.S. government has not made any allegations of significant cybersecurity wrongdoing against Huawei. And that's one of the reasons the U.K. and Germany earlier this year basically pushed back and said, well, the almost year-long campaign of the U.S. to block Huawei around the world is getting very little traction. And those allies, among our closest, said, You haven't said anything, you haven't even alleged that Huawei's done anything wrong, much less provided any evidence. So what they're doing is what I think the cybersecurity experts I talk with behind the scenes recognizes. You need a comprehensive approach to address the risk. And it's not just the equipment, although independent testing of the equipment is necessary. It's also about the telecom and mobile operators. They have to make sure they are following the appropriate standards and best practices, not only so that we can protect personal data, but as we become more dependent on 5G and Internet of Things, we're going to need those systems and networks to be up and running. Our lives are going to depend on it. So it really is important that we raise the bar on cybersecurity, but a comprehensive approach is the only way to go. One frustrating thing is sometimes people hear that I'm a defender of Huawei. They have a tendency not to listen to what I'm actually saying. I would suggest I'm not a defender of Huawei. People say, well, do you trust China or do you trust Huawei? I don't trust anybody. I think the approach has to be, you don't ask people for trust. We need to have mechanisms in place, and they exist, where you don't need to trust anybody because the mechanisms are in place to make sure we have an objective and transparent basis to know that we're going to be okay. That's what we need, objective standards, independent conformance, products, and telecom and mobile operators.
Now, okay, and I hear what you're saying, that there needs to be a broad approach to this. But when it comes to Huawei, what have you told the government or indicated to the industry that you're willing to do to show we are trustworthy?
Well, the government's not willing to meet with us, and that is certainly one of the direct consequences of the U.S.-China trade talks. In a normal situation, they would talk to us. And in fact, some of the different messages that go public among administration officials creates some misunderstanding by people. They're kind of like, oh, well, is there a possibility that Huawei is just going to be able to do business in the United States? The fact is, Huawei will never be allowed to do business in the United States under less restrictive conditions than Nokia and Ericsson operate under. They're only allowed to operate in the United States because they operate pursuant to government-monitored risk mitigation, which undoubtedly includes product testing, despite their deep ties to China. The assembly, the manufacture, the R&D that takes place in China, their alliances with the Chinese government. Somehow they've found means to address the risk. We just like to have a conversation with the U.S. government about what kinds of risk mitigation could be put in place. But it's not just about the equipment. It's also got to be about the strength of the customers, the strength of the telecom operators, and making sure that any equipment vendor, when they later service the equipment, there have to be strict controls, such as we impose on ourselves and with our customers, so that there's not an opportunity for any foreign power to use that access to service equipment to cause harm to the United States or our allies.
And along those lines, how would you paint the risk or the landscape when it comes to supply chain security? Because I know that right now, the U.S. is very focused on that Chinese flag of origin, right? And that's a big place our risk is coming from. But how do you view it?
Well, I think there's been an awful lot done by NIST, the U.S. standards body under the Commerce Department, in collaboration with DHS and the private sector, trying to get a better understanding of what is supply chain risk and what you have to do about it. We have a global supply chain, which important components of which almost everything come from China. So we have to make sure that we have mechanisms in place to understand what the risk is and to mitigate the risk. For example, our telecom operators, like the ones in the United Kingdom. The Parliamentary Committee of the UK this summer said if Huawei were banned from the UK networks would be less safe because it's important to have diversity of suppliers. Our networks have to segment the network so that inevitably the bad guys have the ability to penetrate. The question is, how much harm can they do? We have to assume that we can't block them. We have to assume that they're going to get in, but we have to make sure they can't do very much harm, such as encrypting the data, some of the additional authentication requirements that 5G is going to require. Some of those mechanisms are going to help address the risk in this emerging technology.
And what does the security risk landscape look like in a 5G world? I mean, that's a valid question, right? Well, I think back to a 2019 press briefing I was in with Rob Joyce, the head of cyber at the National Security Agency, NSA. He explained the concerns about the Chinese supplying and building our future 5G network. Here's his quote. When I say trust, there's a desire to examine it, and we will work hard on standards and on examining products. But I can tell you with the two hats we have at NSA, both the information assurance, cybersecurity hat, and the foreign intelligence hat, It is really hard with something that size and magnitude to lock it down where it can't be exploited. So you need to have a trust relationship with the people who build the house. If it's built without a solid foundation, you're going to be unhappy with the way it turns out. And that's how we view it in the 5G discussion. It really isn't about the show me the smoking gun intelligence or about how they're going to steal my information. It's, can I trust it? And what are we going to rely on 5G technology for? It's going to be something very intertwined with our society. Again, that was Rob Joyce from the NSA. But what does Huawei's Andy Purdy think about this idea of trust in the technology that builds America's 5G network? Let's go back to the conference where he explains how he sees it.
The old concepts of trust aren't good enough anymore. President Reagan's during the arms race with the then Soviet Union, trust but verify. That's not good enough. We have to have mechanisms in place. And yes, the complexity of 5G is important, but you got to look at the standards efforts. You have to look at the ability to add encryption. So there's a lot of things that aren't being said quite accurately about what 5G means and what it entails. But there's a global effort to make sure that with each rollout of like business scenarios of 5G, the first one's beginning with speed for mobile devices, that there are standards to make sure that the system is more safe than it was before. And in fact, we've been criticized because we're active in the standards efforts. A lot of companies and governments are. But I'd encourage the U.S. government, jump in, the water's fine. Everybody needs a lot of help in understanding what the threats are, understanding what the vulnerabilities are, and how we can address those, how we can manage the risk and promote resilience in a way that provides transparency. That's what the European Union's trying to do. They're going to do a big threat mapping of 5G. That's what Germany's doing. That's what we all have to do, because it takes hard work to identify the most significant threats and make sure you have processes and tools in place that guarantee you're not going to be harmed by that particular threat.
Speaking of trust, as we know, a lot of U.S. intellectual property ends up in the hands of the Chinese. And I think this is part of the reason that there's so much suspicion around security as well. I saw an interview with you on CNBC where you talked about steps that China is taking to slow down this IP theft. What's been happening there?
Well, actually, in the last couple of years, China passed a law that strengthens their intellectual property regime. It also adds an appellate court. So they're basically creating a rule of law, a system of law to adjudicate these issues. And they're not nearly as far along as the United States is. They also passed a law on forced technology transfer. Both forced technology transfer, that's where China would force a non-Chinese company to turn over intellectual property or force a partnership with a local provider before they can do business, and would affect non-Chinese companies investing in China. That law has significantly revised the burdensome nature of what they've required and the flexibility of non-Chinese companies to invest. And moving in the right direction for an intellectual property regime is a good step. As I said on CNBC, it's not the answer, but it's moving in the right direction. But those are major priorities of the trade talks. The U.S. wants to make sure to help American companies and non-Chinese companies around the world to make sure there's fairness, there's freedom of competition. And on kind of a separate point, the issue of making sure that the international regime pays attention to and sanctions anyone who steals intellectual property. That's very, very important to protect those rights.
Now, given China's track record, do you believe what he's saying? Are you in agreement with the points that he's made so far, or maybe some of them? Let us know. media@secureworldexpo.com is the address. Now, in a minute, hear what Andy Purdy means when he says Huawei is more important to the United States than the United States is to Huawei. Now, let's take a look at some eye-opening research on 5G technology and the associated risks. I just finished reading both a research paper and a special report from Trend Micro, and the documents do a great job of explaining the difference between 4G and 5G, which gives you a glimpse of 5G's power. And they consist of today's Trend Micro top 3. Number 1, Threat actors and their attacks on decades-old telecommunications technologies will be interoperable within 5G's new cyber telecom domain. The Cytel organized crime groups already have an active and full ecosystem right now, and the 5G environment will be a new frontier for doing more quickly. Number 2, SIM jacking will continue to be a risk in 5G. This happens by abusing the SIM, OTA, SMS operational technology. And with 5G, SIM jacking malware's impact can be more scalable and increase the speed with which it can modify trusted SIM-authorized traffic in a network. Number 3, poisoning decision engines and artificial intelligence and machine learning deployments will be a risk. 5G is dependent on what are called nested tiers of automation. Basically, in English, this means clouds within clouds. This dependence on a variety of decision engines is a critical element of the speed and scalability of 5G. Poisoning decision engines could lead to bad rules that can take us down a rabbit hole to network-based attacks, things like sabotage, espionage, and supply chain abuses. That is today's Trend Micro Top 3, and I will put a link to the research, both the report and the paper, in today's show notes. Now, let's get back to our interview with Huawei Chief Information Security Officer Andy Purdy. We cover a lot of territory in this part of our dialogue at Secure World Seattle, and I wanted to get more direct in my questioning, so I asked him, to your knowledge, has the Chinese government forced Huawei to install any backdoors or tried to force the company to do something like this? Here's his answer.
No, and in fact, no government around the world has tried to pressure us or asked us to do that.
And how do you know, or how can you be sure, or how can customers be sure?
Well, we do probably the most substantial internal testing of our products before they're released. And so we have like a separate business group, for example, that has separate reporting within the company that's responsible. And we spend millions of dollars to use international tools to evaluate our products before they're cleared to leave Huawei. We also have external evaluation centers where governments, companies can come and test our products. We just opened one in March of 2019 in Brussels. We've set one up last fall, about a year ago, in Bonn, Germany. That's where a lot of the work is going on with the German government. Their BSI is their key organization. We also have a government-monitored evaluation center in the United Kingdom, in Banbury, outside of London. So we're probably the most scrutinized company in the world. And although sometimes that means people find some vulnerabilities, they haven't found any intentional backdoors that have been put in. The UK government said that, for example. And so we've really benefited, and we've really taken to heart, and we're going to spend a lot of money to improve our software engineering processes. And frankly, we think our competitors would benefit if somebody would independently test their products also.
Interesting. Okay. Do you believe that the U.S. is being harmed right now by the position that the administration has taken towards Huawei? And if so, how?
Well, I think the overarching issue is Huawei more important to the U.S. or is the U.S. more important to Huawei? And the fact is there's no question that the U.S. isn't really all that important to Huawei. I mean, you saw our third quarter revenues were in dramatic increase. And we're now able to ship our 5G components with our 5G parts with no U.S. components. So in terms of harm to the U.S., it remains to be seen a little bit. Over 200 companies want to be allowed to sell to us. That's over $11 billion a year. It's been estimated that could be 40,000 jobs or more. So that's a potential harm to the U.S. Obviously, one of the companies that we want to buy from is Google, so we're pursuing a path to create our own mobile services similar to Google. If we can't, we want to come back and work with Google. But if we can't, and it's going to take some time, it'll cause some pain, but we'll be able to do it. On the other hand, where do we make money? Well, we make very little money in the United States. We have 60 very small mobile and internet providers. 40 of them are rural America. And right now they're under assault to rip and replace our gear. The fact is that cannot be done in the time frame the U.S. government wants or the amounts of money involved, and it's really going to hurt a lot of these small companies. And it's not necessary. The risk can be addressed, as some of our customers have suggested to the FCC. They've suggested some specific things with some expert company giving them advice about how you can address the risk. And we hope we can talk to the U.S. government about these things as well.
And when you talk about your equipment, having to be ripped out from some of these smaller networks, and you think about all of the noise that has been made around Huawei, do you feel like the company's getting a fair shake right now? I mean, are you being treated fairly? Well,
there's a toxic political environment that makes it really hard for anybody to come out and say anything contrary to the general anti-Huawei line. Although Brad Smith, the head of Microsoft, recently came out and said that the U.S. government was being unfair. Bill Gates came out and said, this is nuts what the U.S. is doing. And some other people have done the same. We would like to be able to have a conversation. We believe it's critically important to have objective standards and conformance programs and product testing. That's how we can make ourselves safer. And so even if we aren't going to get to compete in the U.S. in a while, hopefully the U.S. will strengthen those capabilities so we'll be safer, although our technology won't be quite as good without Huawei.
I'm sure you had to get that in there. That's very good, very good. All right, what would a risk-based approach across the infrastructure look like, in your opinion? What should it look like? How should we be evaluating who can do business in the U.S. and who can't, or what have you? But that's just the example we'll work off of.
Well, it's the kind of thing that it looks like the European Union is going to create. They did their 5G risk assessment. Germany looks like they're going to create it. And the idea is coming up with some objective standards, or identifying which standards you want to use, and then coming up with a certification that the products will be tested relative to that certification. So that's in the product. One of the three stools of the triad of what's necessary is the product verification and evaluation. The other is the mobile and telecom operators. What is their capability to make sure they're doing their part of the shared responsibility? Do they have the ability to manage the traffic in the network? Can they look for anomalous conduct? Are they participating in information sharing with the government so that people can connect the dots to find out whether bad things are happening? So, and the third is for us, or the equipment vendors. What are the processes and procedures and tools where, after we've installed gear, in those situations where the company allows us to do servicing and some don't, what are the tools and processes to make sure that we cannot be subject to the undue influence of the China government? And all the equipment vendors need to have standards for that. And we're happy to discuss what we do, because what we do we think is excellent. To provide pure transparency. So we can't be forced to share information with the China government that we don't have.
And by the way, Purdy claims that Huawei's Chinese networks never touch U.S. customers. So do you believe the things he's saying? Agree with him? Are you angered by them? Send us your comments to media@secureworldexpo.com. Now, my last questions, by the way, for Andy Purdy were personal. What is it like, I asked him, to be on the front lines of a company that has been condemned and questioned by so many voices, seemingly from around the globe?
Well, it hasn't been that bad. I mean, there have been a couple times on social media that, I've been called a traitor. There's been situations where a U.S. senator will comment quite negatively on something I said, for example, in a Washington Post article. And it's frustrating the way social media works, and I'm not expert in it, so I was kind of surprised to see a senator has 3 million followers, and they read exactly what he said about me. But then when I post a response, requesting a meeting, or let's have a public or private meeting, like 5 people see it.
Right.
It's like, how do you have a dialogue in that way? It doesn't seem fair,
Yeah, that is tough. Yeah, those who have the big Twitter followers, they've got a lot of power. That is very true. Last question for you. You have a million things to do. I know you're busy. I know you travel around the globe in your role. But here you are, you're speaking today at Secure World Seattle and answering questions from the security community. Why are you here? And then secondly, what is your message to the security community, that many of whom are listening right now?
Well, these are people that are really at the heart of it. In fact, after I was on CNBC, I get a number of notes by LinkedIn or tweets basically saying, right on, Andy, you're giving the right message. We got to test everybody's equipment, So Plus, I can learn. I mean, I go and look at some of the booths here. Questions are good. You get good information. But my message is, it is necessary and possible to effectively address real cyber supply chain risk.
And you believe you guys have the method to do that?
Right. You can't eliminate all risk, and I'm not saying we're perfect, but we're doing the kind of mechanisms, the kind of best practices that can provide assurance and transparency. We're happy to talk to folks about additional ways that we might be able to improve.
Great. And then where do you go from here? What does it look like as you're pushing ahead into 2020? What are your priorities going to be for you in your role as Chief Security Officer?
Well, in the internal role, it's a continuous effort to make sure that we understand and update all the various requirements for the different parts of the business from a cybersecurity and user privacy protection. So I chair a committee in the U.S., just like globally we have a committee where all the business groups, HR, IT, legal, service delivery, are all part of it. And so we have requirements within each one, and we have to make sure that we're meeting those requirements. And sometimes as things change, we have to update them. We're going through our annual cybersecurity refresher training right now. You know, I believe in all that stuff. It's no fun to have to create the test or take the test, but it's a continuous improvement kind of thing. But trying to provide input, direct and indirect, to the efforts in the European Union, for example, and what Germany's doing. But I get to go to a number of countries that are kind of feeling the heat from the United States, and they want to make sure that for their bosses, they've done their due diligence. They understand what we do, what we can do, what's happening in the world, so that way they can make sure they're addressing real cybersecurity risks. So this pressure has had the benefit of raising the understanding and concern of organizations around the world that cybersecurity and privacy protection matters. You have to do concrete things to do them, and you have to try to do them in a way that's transparent and hopefully with metrics, so your bosses and government stakeholders know you're doing what needs to be done.
And that job for Huawei is clearly not done, or Andy Purdy might not be appearing on the Secure World sessions during this episode. By the way, I walked into a session in Seattle, and Purdy was in the middle of a very pointed exchange with members of the audience. Moderator Craig Spiesel followed up by saying, "This is what happens when we give Andy too much caffeine." The audience actually laughed. It was a light-hearted moment in what we can imagine is a tough job as the Chief Security Officer of Huawei, and we appreciate Andy's time. Now let's talk about next time. We're learning about the shifting legal landscape of privacy and cybersecurity. Are you having trouble keeping up with this moving target? Jordan Fisher of Xpan Law Group is an expert on this. Her sessions at our Secure World conferences are typically standing room only. So she's going to clearly explain where we are at this point when it comes to cyber law, help us understand trends pointing to what's next, and how your organization can start to get a handle on this game of whack-a-mole where state by state, new privacy and security regulations keep popping up. That's next time. Now, one last thing. If you have a minute, will you please rate or like our podcast? That will help spread the word to the greater cybersecurity community and help fulfill the Secure World mission. On behalf of the Secure World team, I'm Bruce Sussman, your host of the Secure World Sessions, and let's catch up again on the next episode.